I built a fortress in Northern Idaho to keep the world out, wiring 80 acres with cameras to watch for the only predators I feared, other humans. But in the winter of 1996, my monitors captured an invasion I never prepared for. A family of giants who didn't want to kill me, they just wanted to survive. I have 18 months of surveillance footage proving that Bigfoot is real and that he makes a better neighbor than any man I've ever known. But I had to bury the evidence to save us both. Before we unlock the compound, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you want to hear more true stories about the unexplained, make sure to subscribe to the channel. They call it the Idaho Panhandle, but I call it the last defensible position in the continental United States. My name is Jerry Blackwood, and in 1996, I was 48 years old and done with the charade of civilized society. I bought 80 acres of hardscrabble timber near the Canadian border, not because the view was pretty, but because the sight lines were clear. I was a former military contractor who had spent 2 decades building infrastructure for regimes that didn't exist on paper. I knew how fragile the system was because I had helped pour the concrete for its foundation. I came here to be the king of a kingdom of one, surrounded by barbed wire and silence. My compound wasn't a home, it was a hardened facility. I felled the trees myself to create fire breaks and clear fields of fire, leaving nothing to chance. I built the main cabin out of reinforced concrete logs, bulletproof, fireproof, and government-proof. I lived off the grid, generating my own power with a diesel generator and a bank of lead-acid batteries that took up half the basement. I didn't want a mailbox. I didn't want a phone line. I wanted to be a ghost in the machine, a blank spot on the census map where the rules of Washington, D.C. didn't apply. The centerpiece of my paranoia was the security system. In '96, you couldn't just buy wireless cameras at the hardware store. I ran miles of coaxial cable through underground conduit, trenching the frozen earth until my hands bled. I installed 12 hardwired motion-activated cameras covering every approach, every deer trail, and every blind spot on the property. They were industrial-grade units encased in weatherproof housings, looking like mechanical vultures perched in the trees. I didn't install them to watch the wildlife. I installed them to watch for the 2-legged predators who wear badges and suits. My living room looked less like a den and more like the command center of a submarine. A bank of 12 black and white CRT monitors hummed on the wall, bathing the room in a cold, blue, flickering light. I spent my nights in a swivel chair, drinking black coffee and scanning the screens. Camera 1, the gate. Camera 4, the creek. Camera 9, the ridge. It was a panopticon of my own making. I was the warden and the prisoner, locked in a self-imposed solitary confinement that I convinced myself was freedom. I had learned the hard way that trust is a liability. In my line of work, the guy shaking your hand was usually the one checking for a pulse to see if you were dead yet. I brought that cynicism to the woods. I didn't talk to the locals in town when I went in for supplies. I paid in cash, kept my head on a swivel, and drove a route that changed every time. I was waiting for the inevitable, the knock on the door, the seizure order, the black helicopters. I was prepared for a siege. The isolation was absolute, and that's exactly how I liked it. The silence of the winter woods was heavy, pressing against the glass. But it was an honest silence. Nature doesn't lie to you. A blizzard doesn't have a hidden agenda. A wolf doesn't smile at you before it bites your throat out. I found a strange comfort in the brutality of the elements. It was binary. You either prepared or you died. There was no bureaucracy in hypothermia, just cold, hard physics. My routine was military in its precision. 0500, wake up. 0530, perimeter check. I walked the fence line every morning with a rifle slung over my shoulder, checking for cut wires or boot prints. I maintained the cameras with obsessive care, cleaning the lenses of frost and spiderwebs. If a squirrel chewed a cable, I fixed it before breakfast. The system had to be perfect because my safety depended on seeing the threat before it saw me. I was fighting a war that hadn't started yet, keeping watch over an empty battlefield. I recorded everything. A bank of VCRs in the basement cycled through 6-hour tapes, creating a magnetic archive of nothing happening. I had shelves full of labeled cassettes. North Perimeter, Jan 12. East Gate, Feb 4. It was hours of wind blowing through the pines and deer staring blankly at the lens. Most people would call it madness, hoarding footage of an empty forest. I called it intelligence gathering. You document the baseline so you can spot the anomaly. The fall of '96 came on fast and hard, the temperature dropping like a stone. The elk moved down into the valleys, and the snow started to pile up against the camera housings. The world turned monochrome, black trees against white snow, rendered in the grainy grayscale of the monitors. I hunkered down, checking my fuel reserves, ready for 6 months of being snowed in. I thought the biggest threat I faced was cabin fever or a blown generator gasket, but in late November, the patterns on the screens began to change. It started with camera 7, the one overlooking the old logging road on the North Ridge. I was dozing in the chair, the monitors humming a lullaby of static, when the motion sensor tripped. A red light blinked on the console. I sat up, adrenaline dumping into my system, and stared at the grainy image. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. Something massive had just walked past the lens, blocking out the infrared illuminator for a full 3 seconds. People ask me if I get lonely. I tell them loneliness is a luxury. It means you're safe. I didn't retreat to these woods because I hate people. I retreated because people are the delivery mechanism for chaos. Every handshake is a potential compromise. Every conversation a data leak. I learned in the desert that the guy guarding your back is usually the one paid to put a knife in it. So I cut the cord. I stopped being a citizen and started being a sovereign entity, operating under my own flag on 80 acres of sovereign dirt. My perimeter fence isn't just barbed wire. It's a psychological threshold. You cross that line and you are entering a jurisdiction where 911 doesn't work. I posted no trespassing signs, but those were for the lawyers. The real warnings were the tripwires connected to flashbangs and the concealed pits meant to break an ankle. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone necessarily. I just wanted to make the cost of admission too high to pay. My property was a denial of access area, a black hole where the curious disappeared and the persistent got hurt. The cameras were my eyes, but they were also my obsession. I trusted the lens more than I trusted my own memory. A lens doesn't hallucinate, it doesn't get tired, and it doesn't have an agenda. I spent hours analyzing the grain of the feed, looking for the telltale glint of a sniper scope or the tread pattern of a federal boot. I assumed that they were watching me, so I had to watch back harder. It was a Cold War fought in the static of a CRT monitor, a staring contest with an invisible enemy. I viewed the local town as a biohazard zone. When I had to go in for diesel or dry goods, I treated it like a tactical insertion. I wore drab clothes, kept my head down, and spoke in monosyllables. The cashier at the hardware store wasn't a neighbor, she was a potential informant. The sheriff drinking coffee at the diner wasn't a protector. He was the enforcement arm of the state. I saw potential betrayal in every smile. I paid cash, burned the receipts, and vanished before anyone could learn my name. My paranoia wasn't unfounded, it was professional. I knew what the government could do because I had seen the budgets. I knew about the satellite sweeps and the thermal imaging drones before the public even knew they existed. I built my cabin with a thermal break in the roof to mask my heat signature. I buried my trash to avoid leaving a forensic trail. I was playing a game of hide and seek with the most powerful surveillance apparatus on Earth, and I intended to win. Inside the wire, I lived by a code of absolute self-reliance. If it broke, I fixed it. If I needed it, I made it. Reliance on the grid is weakness. I had 3 years of freeze-dried food stored in airtight drums in the root cellar, enough ammo to fight a small revolution, and a medical kit that could handle a gunshot wound. I wasn't prepping for the end of the world. I was prepping for the arrival of the world at my doorstep. The collapse of society didn't scare me. The knock of a census worker did. I mapped the blind spots of my own psyche. I knew that isolation could make you see things, so I developed rigid protocols to ground myself in reality. I kept a detailed logbook of everything I did, every bolt I tightened, every can of beans I opened. It was my way of auditing my own sanity. If I couldn't trust the outside world, I had to be absolutely certain I could trust the man in the mirror. Doubt was an internal enemy I couldn't afford to harbor. The winter was my ally. I loved the snow because it was the ultimate truth teller. You can't move through 3 feet of powder without leaving a history of your passage. I watched the weather reports with a grim satisfaction, rooting for the storms that would close the passes and seal me in. The deeper the snow, the safer I felt. It was a white blanket that smothered the noise of civilization, a physical barrier that kept the chaos at bay. I had forgotten the sound of a human voice that wasn't my own. I didn't listen to the radio or watch TV. I listened to the wind in the wires and the hum of the diesel generator. Those were honest sounds. They were the heartbeat of my survival. I had purged the unnecessary noise from my life, stripping existence down to its raw mechanics. Eat, sleep, patrol, maintain. It was a monastic existence, dedicated to the worship of security. But even the best system has a flaw, and usually, the flaw is the assumption that you know the enemy. I had built my fortress to keep out men with badges and guns. I had calibrated my motion sensors for vehicles and upright walkers. I was looking for the threats I knew, the tactical teams and the curious trespassers. I wasn't looking for something that didn't appear in any manual. I wasn't prepared for a breach that would challenge not my security, but my reality. The anomaly appeared on camera 9, the unit monitoring the limestone ridge on the northern perimeter. It was 200 hours, the dead of night, with a blizzard howling outside that obscured the lens with blowing snow. I was pouring my 3rd cup of coffee when the motion sensor LED flashed red. I didn't jump. I just slid the chair over. assuming it was a coyote triggering the beam. But when I cleared the static, the shape on the screen froze my blood. It was upright, massive, and moving with a terrifying fluid grace through waist-deep drifts. It wasn't a man in a ghillie suit. It was a tank made of muscle and fur. I hit the record button on the VCR, my hand shaking slightly for the first time in years. I watched as a second shape followed the first, then a third, fourth, and fifth. It was a patrol. No, a family unit. 2 adults, immense and imposing, flanking 3 smaller figures that struggled in the wake of their parents. They weren't moving like a tactical team sweeping an area. They were moving like refugees. They were trudging, heads down against the wind, looking for shelter. They weren't hunting. They were escaping the cold. I tracked them across the grid, switching from camera 9 to camera 8 as they moved down the ravine. I had a Barrett .50 caliber rifle in the safe that could turn a truck engine into scrap metal at a mile, but I didn't reach for it. My brain was trying to process the data, cycling through threat assessments. They carried no weapons. They wore no radios. They didn't scan the horizon for surveillance. They were biological entities, cryptids that weren't supposed to exist, walking through my backyard as if they owned the lease. They stopped near an old rock overhang about 400 yards from my cabin. It was a natural blind spot I had meant to dynamite shut but never got around to. The large male, I called him Alpha immediately, stopped and sniffed the air, looking directly at the hidden camera housing. He didn't growl, he just stared, his eyes reflecting the infrared light like 2 burning coals. He knew the device was there, but he didn't attack it. He assessed it, dismissed it, and turned back to his family. I watched them clear out the debris under the overhang with efficiency that put a construction crew to shame. The adults moved boulders that would have required a winch for me to shift. They weren't frantic. They were methodical. They were building a nest. They pulled down pine boughs and wove them into a windbreak, creating a thermal barrier against the storm. It was engineering, primitive but effective. They were digging in for the winter. The survivalist in me screamed that this was a breach. My perimeter had been penetrated. I had unauthorized biologicals in Sector 4. The protocol said to drive them out, to fire warning shots or deploy flashbangs. But I stayed in the chair, mesmerized. I was watching a masterclass in survival. These things were enduring conditions that would kill a Navy SEAL in hours, and they were doing it with nothing but their own biology. I felt a strange, grudging respect welling up. Real recognized real. I zoomed in on the juveniles. They were shivering, huddled together in a pile of fur. The female sat with them, grooming the snow out of their coats, checking their feet. It was a scene of domestic tenderness that clashed violently with the monster movies I had seen as a kid. They weren't killing machines. They were parents trying to keep their kids from freezing to death. I looked at the temperature gauge on my wall. 15 degrees. If I forced them out now, the little ones would die. I spent the entire night watching the feed, drinking pot after pot of coffee. I analyzed their hierarchy. The big male stood guard at the edge of the overhang, taking the brunt of the wind while the family slept. He rotated his position every hour, scanning the woods. He was doing exactly what I did, maintaining a perimeter. We were 2 sentries guarding our respective caves, separated by 400 yards of snow and 1,000,000 years of evolution. By dawn, the storm had broken, leaving the world buried in silence. The family was still there. They hadn't raided my trash. They hadn't tried to breach the cabin. They were simply existing in the shelter I had unwittingly provided. I realized with a jolt that my isolation was over. I wasn't alone on the mountain anymore. I had tenants, and unlike the humans I despised, these tenants hadn't asked for anything, demanded nothing, and brought no politics with them. I picked up my logbook and opened a new page. I didn't write target acquired. I wrote Observation Day 1, North Ridge Camp. I decided to let the violation of my borders slide just this once. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And looking at that big male staring defiantly into the teeth of the winter wind, I realized we shared a common enemy: the cold, the world, and the struggle to stay alive. But now that they were settled, the question was, how long would they stay? And what were the rules of this new cohabitation? The first face-to-face contact happened 3 days later at the woodpile. I walked out at 800 to split kindling, my AR-15 slung over my back, tactical habit hardwired into my spine. The alpha male was standing at the edge of the clearing, 50 yards away, watching me. He didn't crouch, and he didn't bare his teeth. He just stood there, leaning one massive hand against a Douglas fir, looking like a landlord inspecting a tenant. I stopped, axe in hand, and let the silence stretch between us like a wire. I didn't raise the rifle. I nodded, a sharp, singular downward motion of the chin. acknowledgement. He held my gaze for a solid 10 seconds, his breath pluming in the cold air like exhaust from a semi-truck. Then he mimicked the nod. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He wasn't challenging me for dominance. He was establishing a truce. He slowly turned his back, the ultimate display of confidence, and walked back toward the ridge. In that moment, the rules of engagement shifted. We weren't predator and prey. We were two sovereign powers sharing a border. The Cold War had turned into a detente. I began to notice a pattern to their movements on the surveillance monitors. They avoided the red zone, the immediate 50-yard radius around my cabin. They understood that the house was my den, my hard perimeter. They moved freely through the outer sectors, using the logging roads and the creek bed, but they gave the cabin a respectful berth. It wasn't fear, it was professional courtesy. They recognized the concept of personal space, perhaps better than any human neighbor I'd ever had. I responded in kind. When I patrolled the fence line, I stopped checking the sector near their overhang. I gave them their privacy. I made a point of making noise when I approached their area, coughing, snapping twigs, to broadcast my position. I wasn't sneaking up on them. I wanted them to know that I wasn't a threat to their young. We were negotiating a treaty of non-aggression without speaking a single word, drafting the clauses in footprints and sightlines. The boundaries became ritualized. If I was working on the generator shed, the Alpha would sit on a stump 100 yards up the slope watching. He wasn't hiding. He was supervising. It was unnerving at first, having an 8-foot giant auditing my chores, but I got used to it. I realized he was studying my tools, my movements, the way I manipulated the physical world. I was the strange, hairless ape with the loud machines, and he was the curious anthropologist. The juveniles were the wild cards. I caught them on camera 4 creeping close to the perimeter fence, fascinated by the blinking LEDs on the sensor array. They were testing the limits, like teenagers anywhere. But the moment they got too close to the wire, a low, resonant bark would echo from the trees. The alpha or the female would call them back. They enforced the treaty on their own kin. They understood that the wire meant stop, and they respected my technology enough to fear it. We developed a timeshare arrangement for the property. They used the creek for water in the gray light of dawn and dusk. I used the daylight hours for my work. At night, the woods belonged to them. I stayed inside, watching the monitors, letting them roam the sectors I had cleared. It was a functional rhythm. We weren't stepping on each other's toes. We were rotating shifts in the same factory, keeping the machinery of survival running without friction. I started to test the level of their tolerance. I fired up the chainsaw one afternoon to clear a fallen cedar. Usually the noise would send every animal within a mile running for the next county. The alpha didn't flinch. He sat there, chewing on a pine branch, watching the sawdust fly. He understood the cause and effect. The noise wasn't aggression, it was labor. He categorized the saw as a tool, not a weapon. That level of cognitive discrimination was staggering. The paranoia that had defined my life began to recede, replaced by a strange sense of security. I realized that with them on the property, I was safer than I had ever been. No government agent or trespasser could get within a mile of my cabin without tripping their alarms first. The forest, which used to be a threat vector, was now under the protection of a biological security force that never slept and never missed a thing. I had upgraded my perimeter defense for free. One morning, after a heavy snowfall, I went out to clear the driveway and found something that stopped me in my tracks. The heavy log that usually blocked the access road, a gate I had to winch open every time I drove the truck, had been moved. It wasn't dragged. It had been lifted and set aside gently in the snow. I looked up at the ridge. The alpha was there, watching. He hadn't just respected my boundary, he had interacted with it. He had opened the door. The moved log was the handshake that sealed the deal. I decided to test the parameters of this new labor agreement. I had a stack of railroad ties near the south fence that needed to be moved to the garden plot, back-breaking work that would have taken me 2 days of sweating and cursing. I left them exposed, dragged one a few feet to indicate the destination, and then retreated to the cabin. That night I watched camera 5. The alpha and the female descended on the pile. They didn't struggle. They picked up the ties like they were toothpicks, stacking them neatly at the target site in under 20 minutes. It wasn't just strength, it was comprehension. They understood the objective. I knew that in the wild, nothing is free. If they were expending calories for my benefit, I had to balance the ledger. I went to the meat locker and pulled out 4 frozen elk steaks and a 10-pound bag of apples. I placed them on a flat rock near their ridge camp, a location I dubbed the drop zone. I didn't hide the food, I displayed it. I wanted them to know this wasn't accidental loss. It was payment. I walked away, giving a thumbs up to the tree line. When I checked the feed an hour later, the rock was clean. The transaction was complete. The winter of '97 threw everything it had at us. We got hit with a series of storms that dropped 4 feet of concrete-heavy snow in a week. Shoveling out the compound usually took me 6 hours of heart attack-inducing labor, but on the second morning, I woke up to find the main path from the cabin to the generator shed already cleared. The juveniles had done it. They had used their massive bodies like snowplows, dragging their arms to push the drifts aside. It wasn't a pristine job. It looked like a bulldozer had gone off-road, but it saved me the work. They were maintaining the infrastructure. A strange synergy developed regarding the firewood. I would fell the dead standing timber with my chainsaw, the noise echoing through the valley. As soon as I cut the engine and stepped back, the crew would move in. They would grab the heavy rounds that I would have to quarter to lift and carry them effortlessly to the woodpile. They saved me the most dangerous and exhausting part of the job. I was the precision tool. They were the heavy machinery. We were a 2-species logging operation clearing the fire breaks with industrial efficiency. I started leaving tools out to see what they would do, not the complex stuff, but simple levers and sleds. The Alpha figured out the sled immediately. He watched me dragging feed bags on a plastic toboggan, and the next night, I caught him on camera 3 using the same sled to haul a dead deer carcass back to their camp. He realized that technology multiplies effort. It was a staggering display of adaptive intelligence. He wasn't just surviving in my world, he was upgrading his own methods by watching mine. The true test of our partnership came in February when the temperature bottomed out at 30 below zero. The wind chill was lethal. Their overhang on the ridge wasn't enough. I could see them huddling on the monitor, the frost building up on their fur. I couldn't let my workforce freeze. I went out and unlocked the heavy door to the equipment barn, a large, unheated structure about 50 yards from the main cabin. I propped the door open and left a propane lantern burning inside. It was an invitation. I watched nervously on the monitor as they approached the barn. Entering a human structure is usually a taboo for wild animals. It smells of trap. But the Alpha led the way, sniffing the doorframe, checking for wires. He ushered the family inside. They didn't touch my tractor. They didn't mess with the diesel drums. They simply curled up on the pile of hay in the corner, basking in the radiant heat of the lantern. I slept with my rifle on the nightstand that night, but I never needed it. They treated my property with the respect of a houseguest who knows the rules. This mutual aid society fundamentally changed my economics. I was burning fewer calories, using less fuel, and getting more work done than ever before. In exchange, I hunted more. I became the provider of protein, taking down extra deer to keep the payroll funded. It was the purest form of capitalism I had ever participated in. Goods for services, uncorrupted by taxes or regulation. We had built a microeconomy in the middle of the wilderness, based entirely on the gold standard of survival. The juveniles began to act as scouts. My security cameras were fixed, but the young Bigfoot were mobile. If a coyote pack moved into the valley, the juveniles would throw pine cones at the cabin roof to alert me. If a tree fell across the access road, they would hoot until I came out to see it. They were my forward operating base. I realized that my situational awareness had expanded beyond the monitors. I had eyes in the woods that could smell and hear things my electronics would never catch. As the spring thaw approached, I looked at the Alpha one morning. He was standing by the woodpile, waiting for his share of the venison. I walked out, not with a weapon, but with the meat in my hand. I handed it to him directly, no drop rock, no buffer zone. He took it gently, his massive fingers brushing my glove. In that exchange, I realized something that terrified and thrilled me. I trusted this creature more than I had ever trusted any human contractor. He had never lied to me. He had never skimmed off the top. And I knew with absolute certainty that he never would. I spent 20 years in a world where a handshake was usually a precursor to a shakedown. I've sat across tables from warlords, politicians, and corporate fixers, and the one thing they all had in common was the ability to lie with a straight face. They used language as camouflage, hiding their intent behind layers of protocol and politeness. But out here in the snow, with a 700-pound hominid staring me down, I realized I was finally dealing with an honest broker. The Alpha didn't have the capacity for deceit. If he was angry, he growled. If he was peaceful, he sat down. There was no subtext, no fine print, and no hidden agenda. The communication between us was stripped of all the garbage that clogs up human interaction. We didn't need words to establish the terms of our contract. A pile of meat meant payment. A cleared path meant service rendered. A raised hand meant stop. It was a binary language, ones and zeros, yes and no. It was refreshing. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to second-guess the motives of the guy standing next to me. I knew exactly where I stood with the Alpha because his behavior was perfectly consistent with his reality. He was incapable of the kind of calculated betrayal that requires a human ego. I watched the tapes of them when they thought they were alone. In the human world, that's when the mask slips, when the employee steals from the register or the guard falls asleep. But the Bigfoot were the same in the dark as they were in the light. They didn't test the locks on the cabin when I was sleeping. They didn't try to steal the fuel drums. They respected the boundaries even when the enforcer wasn't watching. That level of integrity is rare in men. In wild animals, it's unheard of. They weren't just following rules out of fear. They were following them out of a sense of order. This honesty created a vacuum that sucked the paranoia right out of me. I found myself leaving the heavy steel shutters on the windows open during the day. I stopped carrying the rifle when I went to the woodpile, downgrading to a sidearm, and then eventually to just a knife. It wasn't carelessness, it was a calculated risk assessment. The threat level had dropped to 0. I realized that my anxiety wasn't about danger in the abstract. It was about the unpredictability of human malice. With the Bigfoot, the malice variable was missing from the equation. One afternoon, I slipped on a patch of black ice near the generator shed. I went down hard, twisting my knee, lying there in the snow, vulnerable and cursing. The alpha was 20 yards away. In the wild, a predator sees weakness and strikes. A human rival might take the opportunity to kick you while you're down. The alpha just took a step forward, tilted his head, and waited. He was checking my status. When I finally hobbled to my feet, he let out a soft huff, almost like a sigh of relief, and went back to stripping bark off a log. He didn't want my weakness. He wanted my continuity. I began to talk to them, not expecting an answer, just to vocalize the trust. "Cold one today, huh?" I'd say to the alpha as we worked on opposite ends of the clearing. He would look at me and make a low, rumbling sound in his chest. It wasn't a conversation, but it was communication. It was the kind of comfortable silence you share with an old war buddy who has seen the same things you have. We were two veterans of the winter, sharing a foxhole, united by the fact that everything outside the wire wanted to kill us. The juveniles were the most transparent of all. They wore their curiosity on their sleeves. If they wanted to see something, they stretched their necks and looked. If they were scared, they hid behind their mother. There was no posturing. Watching them interact with the world reminded me of how much energy humans waste on maintaining an image. These creatures just were. They existed in a state of absolute authenticity. It made me look at my own life, the fences, the cameras, the guns, and wonder how much of it was just a costume I was afraid to take off. I realized that I had found the community I had been searching for when I bought this land. I didn't want isolation. I wanted loyalty. I wanted a tribe that operated on competence and mutual defense. I had found it, but not in the species I was born into. The alpha was a better leader than any commanding officer I'd ever served under. He protected his own, he shared the spoils, and he never issued an order he wouldn't follow himself. I felt a loyalty to him that I hadn't felt since Vietnam. The shift in me was profound. I stopped scanning the horizon for black helicopters and started looking for ways to improve our collective situation. I wasn't just hoarding supplies for my survival anymore. I was thinking about the group. "We need more protein," I'd mutter, checking the freezer. "We need to reinforce the barn roof." The use of the word "we" wasn't accidental. I had been drafted into a new unit, and for the first time in years, I was proud to wear the uniform. As the days grew longer, the curiosity of the young ones became impossible to contain. They were fascinated by the things I held in my hands, the shiny wrenches, the spinning drills, the magic of the tools. They would creep closer, their eyes wide, watching me fix a hinge or sharpen an axe. The alpha didn't call them back anymore. He watched me, gauging my reaction. He was giving me permission. He was trusting me with the most valuable asset he had, and I knew it was time to stop just working alongside them and start showing them how the world worked. It started with a pry bar. The smallest male, I called him Junior, was struggling to flip a frozen slab of slate near the creek bed, likely looking for grubs. He was using brute force, straining his back, getting nowhere against the frozen mud. I walked over with a 4-foot steel crowbar. The alpha tensed up on the ridge, but I moved slowly. I didn't push Junior aside. I just set the tip of the bar under the rock, placed a smaller stone as a fulcrum, and applied a fraction of the pressure he had been using. The slab popped up with a satisfying crack. Junior's eyes went wide. I had just shown him magic, the magic of leverage. I handed him the bar. It looked like a toothpick in his hand, but he mimicked my placement exactly. He struggled with the fulcrum concept at first, but when he finally got the geometry right and the rock flipped, he let out a hoot of pure joy. He looked at the tool, then at me, then at the next rock. He understood immediately that the steel stick made him stronger. That afternoon, I watched on the monitor as he cleared an entire section of the creek bed, using the bar like a seasoned laborer. He wasn't just using a tool, he was understanding the physics of work. The school was unofficial and entirely practical. I didn't teach them tricks, I taught them utility. I showed them how a ratchet strap works, tightening a load of firewood until it hummed. I showed them how to use a wedge to split a log, saving them from bashing it against a rock. They were voracious learners, absorbing the mechanics with an intensity that put human apprentices to shame. They had no ego to get in the way. If I corrected their grip, they didn't argue, they adjusted. They treated the tools with a reverence bordering on religious. The surveillance footage of these sessions is the most surreal thing I have ever seen. Camera 4 recorded me standing in the snow, surrounded by 3 7-foot hairy juveniles, demonstrating the proper way to coil a rope. I look like a drill instructor for a platoon of monsters, but there is a tenderness in the body language. I'm patting them on the shoulder when they get it right. They are nudging me gently to ask for a demonstration. It wasn't a man and beasts, it was an uncle teaching his nephews the family trade. I had to be careful with the sharp stuff. I showed them my axe, running my thumb along the flat of the blade, then slicing a piece of paper to demonstrate the edge. I made a cutting motion across my own arm and shook my head. Danger. They got it. They treated the axe like it was a loaded gun. One of the females reached for it once without looking, and the alpha barked a warning before I could even move. They understood that human claws were detachable and incredibly sharp, and they respected the lethality of the steel. The alpha watched it all from his command post on the stump. He never participated in the lessons, but he permitted them. It was a strategic decision. He recognized that I possessed knowledge that could ensure the survival of his lineage. By allowing me to teach his offspring, he was upgrading their software. He was outsourcing the technical training to the resident expert. I would look up sometimes and catch his eye, and the look wasn't one of jealousy, it was one of gratitude. We were co-parenting the next generation of survivors. My isolation dissolved completely. I found myself narrating my day to them. This is a wrench, I'd say, tightening a bolt on the tractor. Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. They couldn't speak the words, but they watched the rotation. I felt a paternal pride welling up in me that I thought I had buried decades ago. I didn't have kids of my own. My lifestyle didn't allow for it, but teaching Junior how to open a latch gave me a sense of legacy I didn't know I needed. I was passing something on. The trust extended to the cabin itself. I started leaving the tool shed unlocked. It was a massive breach of my old security protocols, but I knew they wouldn't steal. They would borrow. I'd wake up to find the snow shovel missing, only to see it later on the monitor, being used by the female to clear a space for the little ones. They always returned it, leaning it against the wall exactly where I left it. They respected the chain of custody. We had a lending library of hardware, and they had perfect credit. I realized that they were smarter than half the guys I worked with in the military. They had problem-solving skills that were off the charts. If a tool didn't work, they improvised. I watched Junior use a discarded PVC pipe to blow air into a fire to stoke the coals. A bellows. I hadn't taught him that. He had extrapolated the concept of airflow from watching me blow on the kindling. They weren't just mimicking, they were innovating. They were taking my human tech and applying it to their Sasquatch problems. By the time the first buds appeared on the aspens, the dynamic had solidified into a rock-solid alliance. I sat on the porch one evening, watching the family move across the ridge, carrying tools they had borrowed, moving with a purpose and efficiency that we had built together. I had come to the woods to escape humanity, to build a fortress against the world. Instead, I had built a family. I had achieved the ultimate survivalist dream, a self-sufficient, loyal, defensible community. But as I looked at the wall of tapes in my basement, documenting every second of this miracle, I realized that the evidence of my success was the most dangerous thing on the mountain. Spring 1997 broke the back of the winter, turning the world from a prison of ice into a fortress of mud and green shoots. The compound was running like a well-oiled machine, but the power source wasn't diesel, it was cooperation. I looked out over my property and saw the realization of a philosophy I had chased for 30 years. I had wanted a world without bureaucracy, without taxes, and without the interference of the state. I had achieved it, but not with other men. I had built the perfect libertarian society with a family of cryptids. We had a free market of labor and resources, enforcing our own laws, protecting our own borders. The security situation was absolute. I realized that for the first time in my life, I was actually safe. No ATF raid or FBI surveillance team could get within 5 miles of my perimeter without the Bigfoot family knowing. They were the ultimate early warning system, detecting scents and sounds that my electronic sensors missed. I slept soundly, knowing that the Alpha was patrolling the ridge. I had replaced my paranoia with a biological deterrence that no government agency could account for. I was the safest man in America because my bodyguards were monsters. The relationship stripped away my cynicism. I had spent decades believing that community was a weakness, a vector for betrayal. But watching the juveniles learn to use the pry bar and seeing the female grooming the alpha, I realized I had been wrong. Community wasn't the problem. Humanity was. I had found a connection that was pure, based on survival and mutual respect, rather than politics. I felt a sense of belonging that no platoon or contractor unit had ever given me. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. But the tapes in the basement were a ticking time bomb. I had 18 months of continuous footage stacked in cardboard boxes, thousands of hours of black and white proof. I had the alpha moving logs, I had the juveniles using tools, I had the family sleeping in my barn. It was the most significant scientific data ever collected. If I released it, I would change history. I would be the man who proved the existence of the Sasquatch. I would be famous, vindicated, and rich. The temptation to drop that bomb on the world was a siren song. Then I played the scenario out to its logical conclusion. The moment those tapes aired on CNN, the silence of the panhandle would be shattered. The news helicopters would arrive first, then the trophy hunters, then the scientists with their tranquilizer rifles and capture cages. They would hunt the family down. They would tranquilize the alpha, put the juveniles in a zoo, and dissect the female. I would be signing the death warrant of the only beings that had ever shown me unconditional loyalty. And it wasn't just them at risk, it was me. In my zeal to document their lives, I had documented my own. The cameras didn't just catch the Bigfoot, they caught my unregistered suppressors, my modified receivers, and the booby traps on the perimeter. They captured the lifestyle of a man who had spent 20 years dodging the IRS and the federal government. Releasing the tapes would bring the ATF and the FBI to my door with a battering ram. I would be trading my freedom for 15 minutes of fame, and I would be taking my friends down with me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The tapes were a liability. They weren't a legacy, they were a dossier. I was holding the evidence that could destroy everything I had built. The truth was a dangerous weapon, and in this case, it was aimed squarely at our heads. I looked at the wall of VCRs, the blinking lights that had been my obsession, and realized they were the eyes of the enemy I had been trying to escape. I had surveilled myself into a corner. I sat in the chair, watching the alpha on camera 9. He was sitting on the ridge, watching the sunrise, completely unaware that his existence was currently stored on magnetic tape in a basement. He trusted me to protect the territory. He trusted me to keep the bad men away. If I released the footage, I would be the ultimate traitor. I would be the Judas who sold out his family for a headline. The code of the woods is simple. You protect the pack. And like it or not, I was part of the pack now. I made the only choice a soldier could make. I didn't destroy the tapes. The historian in me couldn't bear to burn the proof, but I buried them, literally. I packed the cassettes into watertight ammo cans, sealed them with wax, and buried them under the concrete slab of the generator shed. They are down there right now, a time capsule of the winter we shared. I put a dead man switch on the location. They stay buried until I'm dead and the statute of limitations has run out on my life. I still live on the 80 acres. The family comes and goes with the seasons, and we still share the work. I still watch the monitors, but I don't record anymore. I don't need the proof. I know what's out there. The world can keep its skepticism, its cities, and its laws. I have something better. I have the silence, I have the trust of giants, and I have the peace of knowing that the greatest story never told is safe with me.